Éliane Ubalijoro, CIFOR-ICRAF Chief Executive Officer, and then keynote speech by Andrew Fanning, ecological economist from Doughnut Economics Action Lab. And then we will have panel reactions from Peter Minang, CIFOR-ICRAF Director for Africa, Mulia Nur Hassan, CIFOR-ICRAF Scientist, and Paulo Cerruti, CIFOR-ICRAF Senior Scientist, and Juan Pablo Sarmiento, CIFOR-ICRAF Scientist. And also a response from Andrew Fanning and structured discussion with live and online audience. And also the discussion and the closing remarks will be organized and delivered by Fergus Sinclair, CIFOR-ICRAF Chief Scientist, as the moderator. And ladies and gentlemen, we will commence this event shortly. Okay, good morning and afternoon, and welcome to the CIFOR-ICRAF Science Week 2023, with this year's theme is Equity in Action, providing a unique opportunity to learn about CIFOR-ICRAF's commitment to equity and inclusion and how its work addresses the global challenge of inequity in all its work with and for communities, partners, and governments. I am Pijumarin Sagala, a research consultant at CIFOR-ICRAF, feeling honored to be your master of ceremony today. Respected speakers, session leads, and audiences, welcome to CIFOR-ICRAF's Science Week 2023. And before we begin the first agenda, I would like to inform that for all attendants in Zoom, if you have any questions, kindly use the raise hand reaction, and the moderator will accommodate your questions. And without further ado, please welcome Éliane Ubalijoro. Okay. Without further ado, please welcome Fergus, CIFOR-ICRAF Chief Scientist, as today's moderator. Over to you, Fergus.
Thank you. Live in person from here in Bogor, Indonesia, Nairobi, Kenya, and country offices around the world. Interactively online with CIFOR-ICRAF staff elsewhere, and live streamed globally. This is the CIFOR-ICRAF 2023 Science Week, Equity in Action. CIFOR-ICRAF is the functional merger of the Center for International Forest Research and World Agroforestry, operating under a common board of trustees, and I'm Fergus Sinclair, the Chief Scientist. But let us be in no doubt, Science Week 2023 has been put together not by me, but by a task force comprising staff across the institution, chaired by Paulo Cerruti and Mulia Nur Hassan, who are both panelists in this opening plenary session. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Éliane Ubalijoro, the brand new Chief Executive Officer of CIFOR-ICRAF, who took up this role only last week. So we're incredibly privileged to hear her first address, public address, since her appointment. So Éliane, without further ado, it's over to you to open this Science Week for us all with your opening remarks.
Dear friends and colleagues, it is an honor to be opening CIFOR-ICRAF Science Week, Equity in Action. This is my first address as the new CEO of CIFOR-ICRAF, and I cannot think of a better opportunity for this or a more important event. Over the course of this week, we will discuss gender equity and social inclusion, both in relation to our science and development agenda and in relation to how we work as an institution. These issues are close to my heart. It is worth dwelling on the distinction between equality, equity, and justice for a moment. With equality, everyone is treated the same equally, and outcomes may not be equitable because people have different needs. With equity, people are treated according to their needs equitably, so that with measures that are taken, there are equitable outcomes. With justice, causes of inequity are addressed so that systemic barriers that achieving equal access are removed. People are treated justly, equal rights are asserted and realized for all. Moving from inequality to justice is a journey we're all on. We all have at some point witnessed inequity in the form of unfair, avoidable differences arising from poor governance, corruption, or cultural exclusion. We have also witnessed inequality in the form of the uneven distribution of wealth. We cannot be passive bystanders on this journey. We cannot be witnesses of the victimization of people or the planet. On my own journey, I have gone from being a 17-year-old undergraduate student studying agriculture, where none of my professors who taught me looked like me, and where I was mostly unaware of many of the pioneering women who paved the way for me. I sometimes felt apologetic for being me, in my body, and going on to pursue a master's and PhD in molecular genetics. Later on, becoming a research scientist and professor, leading teams in the biotechnology sector, in academia, in the nonprofit sector, and advising governments. As the first African woman to head a CGIAR center, I'm today the dream of my 17-year-old self. I have had the opportunity between now and then to learn about and work with many pioneering scientists that came from marginalized backgrounds. The power of knowing that leadership can look like any one of us, without bias, as we navigate the digital age, is not to be underestimated. It is with great humility that I join all CIFOR-ICRAF staff and friends around the world to welcome you to our first Science Week open to the public on the wonderful theme of equity in action. This matters to me as an African woman scientist. It matters to the countless smallholder farmers around the world that we at CIFOR-ICRAF strive to support. It matters to the wisdom keepers around the world, from local communities and indigenous populations we work with, and to all levels of intersectionality we interact with. The work we are doing is important for the world today, but also for future generations and for the planet. How we help harness the power of trees, forests, and agroforestry landscapes to address the most pressing global challenges of our times: biodiversity loss, climate change, food security, livelihoods, and inequality is critical for us to embody equity in action. And the just transition we are engaged in is important to bring forward hope through our work, our partnerships, our interdependence, and how we elevate nature. It will depend on how we translate science into solutions that impact achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. As an organization, it's key we recognize that achieving equity and inclusion is not just the right thing to do, but it is also essentially for the success of our work. And it's critical that we ensure that we are operating in a fully equitable and inclusive way. To create a more equitable and just world, we first must recognize that inequality exists. We must acknowledge that certain groups of people are disproportionately affected by poverty, climate change, deforestation, and land degradation. We must listen and engage with these communities, understand their challenges and needs, and work together to develop solutions that are tailored to their unique circumstances. I am so inspired by the work this organization has done. Together, our work and the work of our partners has been transforming how land is used and how food is produced. It has helped governments, indigenous peoples, and local communities develop the tools they need to better conserve and restore ecosystems and respond to climate, malnutrition, biodiversity, and desertification crises. and equity has been at the heart of this work. CIFOR-ICRAF's work is guided by a mission to solve 5 global challenges. One of these challenges is framed as extreme inequality, but it's clear we need to go beyond inequality to address inequity and injustice. We are now deepening our articulation of this global challenge and our response to addressing it. The goal is to facilitate just transitions to more sustainable and equitable food and forest systems. This week is a great opportunity to showcase what we have achieved in contributing to understanding inequity and how to tackle it. It is also an opportunity to reflect on our work and think deeply about how we can continue to improve and adapt as an organization to meet new needs and challenges. There are sessions on the agency of women in the context of equity in food security and nutrition for resilience, catalyzing change through youth and community-based programs, engendering climate justice, soil health, fundraising for the future, and many more, giving us a broad range of opportunities to explore issues that are critical and work that is also critical towards action to address them. A new feature of our Science Week this year is Partners Day on May 10th, where we'll focus on the incredible partnerships that the organization has and the vital role they play in sustainable forest and agroforestry management and policy issues. In line with the 30th anniversary of CIFOR, this year we'll focus Partners Day on our partnerships in Indonesia through a global lens. Over the course of this week, we'll hear from incredible speakers, including many of our own scientists. I encourage you to attend as many sessions as your schedule will allow. And also I also look forward to meeting many of you in the coming week. At CIFOR-ICRAF, we are committed to promoting gender equality and empowering women and girls. We recognize that gender equality is not just a women's issue, but it is a human rights issue. And we are working to ensure that women have access to resources, education, and decision-making positions to enable them to participate fully in the development of their communities. We also understand that achieving equity, diversity, and justice requires that we examine our own practices and policies. And we are committed to creating an inclusive work environment where everyone feels valued and supported. Finally, I want to emphasize that achieving equity, diversity, and justice is not a one-time event. It is an ongoing process that requires constant attention and effort. As an organization, we will continue to learn and grow, to challenge ourselves, and to hold ourselves accountable. I'm excited about the journey ahead and the opportunity to work with all of you to create a more equitable and just world. Thank you to those of you joining us in person in our 2 hub locations in Bogor and in Nairobi. And I thank you, those. I also thank those joining us from country offices and also tuning in remotely to this important event. I look forward to the discussions, sharing, and lessons from this week, and to supporting the organization in building a better world for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Éliane, for those inspiring words. And we want to move straight on to our first keynote presentation, which is going to be given by Andrew Fanning from the Doughnut Economics Action Lab. And he's going to be looking at equity in action for people and the planet. So please, Andrew, take it away.
Fergus, sorry, it's Fabio here. I don't think Andrew has joined us yet. I'm going to write to him.
That's a bit of a problem.
Apologies.
Andrew's joining us from Spain, where he's based. How many of you know the Doughnut Economics Action Lab? Oh, quite a lot of you, that's good. Kate Raworth published a book called Doughnut Economics a few years ago, and since then has had a very vibrant group working on taking a different view of economics that is trying to meet well-being thresholds at the same time as keeping us within planetary boundaries. Planetary boundaries being the Rockstrom formulation of how human activity is causing us to go beyond planetary limits. I'm hoping that Andrew will join us any minute. How are we getting on, Fabio?
Well, I just wrote to him and give him a minute to react. But hopefully he will be with us. We have his presentation, but I don't think anybody can actually run it. I don't know.
Well, I already started giving part of it, but I think it would be better coming from him.
Totally. Yeah, I wrote to him. So
While we're waiting, I'm just going to clarify a couple of things because it's really important. Some people got worried by the label closed session. So for example, there's a session on voluntary carbon markets. By closed, it doesn't mean it's closed to you. It means it's not being web streamed. But please, it's really important that CIFOR-ICRAF staff are in those closed sessions, because those are the sessions where we're able to talk freely amongst ourselves. So they're really important sessions for developing the CIFOR-ICRAF program going forward. So they're very open to you. So please don't be confused by that label of closed session. If anything, more significant and important. Any progress, Fabio?
I don't see him in the room yet. Apologies for this.
Was he with you earlier?
Nope. I think he might be confused by the many different timings that we work with. Fergus, do you have his phone number by any chance?
I don't. My phone is not
we're waiting, maybe we can have a dialogue with Elaine.
Éliane.
Éliane, I'm so sorry.
I'm not sure whether she's prepared for that. Éliane, are you still online?
Because I think for
Yes,
a
I'm
lot
here.
of us.
Éliane, while we're waiting for Andrew, there's been a
Absolutely.
suggestion.
I'm happy.
Yep.
Yes.
Yes.
Are you happy to take some questions?
I'm happy to take questions. I'm just going to take off all my tags just to, but I was seated. But yeah, I'm absolutely happy to take questions from anybody across CIFOR-ICRAF. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Let's use this as an opportunity. Any crisis should be used as an opportunity. So please feel free to ask me any questions you have. And yes, my name is Éliane. Éliane is a French name. So your spell check will try and always change it to Elaine, but that's not my name. So just so you know, it's Éliane in French. That's exactly how you pronounce it. You can pronounce it Éliane, Éliane in English, and any other way you want. I'm from Rwanda, so in Kinyarwanda, you'd probably pronounce it Iriane. So I'm okay with any type of pronunciation, but don't call me Elaine, please.
Apologies.
Okay. No, please. Here's one of the things I also wanted to share is, this is my 5th day on the job. And what I see is the first year, we want to be super ambitious and achieve a lot, but we're going to fail forward. And so what I know is in order to grow, we have to fail forward to have something to learn and grow. And so, let's take any opportunity for failure to learn and grow together. And so please, no need to apologize, but let's make sure we take all these lessons and learn and grow.
Did you want to ask her something, Annie?
Many people have questions, not me yet.
Okay, please,
Okay.
if you're going to ask a question, can you please say who you are first? Let's take Mulia.
Thank you very much for the great idea. I've been waiting for this opportunity actually, and I was hoping, and like you said, it's very nice to handle the crisis with this conversation. So I wasn't very much aware. I have maybe like a little bit of controversial questions, but I hope you're open to it. That your background in biotechnology all throughout the education, what do you think and how do you find it, and how would you think it fits to the nature-based solution which many organizations, including ours, have been promoting, and how do you see biotechnology fits into this nature-based solution? Thank you.
Okay, I didn't get your name and
I'm Mulia. You can
okay, Mulia.
Yeah, you can just say Mu also sometimes.
Okay. Okay, so Mulia, this is a really great question because it's going to help me clarify. So when I went to university at 17, my aim was to work with smallholder farmers. I did my undergraduate degree in general agriculture. So I really just wanted to get a sense of plant science, animal science, hydrology and drainage, ecology, really just understand the different areas of importance to farmers. So when I was finishing my undergraduate degree, this was 1992. And so at the time, Rwanda, where I'm from, was going through a civil war. And so I knew that in order for me to stay in Canada, I wanted to be able to work at the cutting edge of innovation. And the cutting edge of innovation in 1992 was the area of DNA and molecular genetics. And so I went on to do my master's degree in plant molecular virology, where I looked at the genetics of plant species and their capacity for resistance to viruses. So I was doing mapping. And so that intent was really to support plant breeders in producing more robust viral resistant varieties to diseases. I then went on to do my PhD in the study of mycorrhizal fungi. So I actually did my PhD looking at the phylogenetics of arbuscular mycorrhiza, and I produced one of the first molecular DNA libraries of mycorrhizal fungi. And so this work for me was really about understanding the biodiversity that's critical to our soil health, that is represented by mycorrhizal fungi. And we were doing tissue culture of mycorrhizal fungi, which was very new at the time. And so I actually, yes, I learned to produce transgenic crops, but none of my work actually in my studies in terms of where I was aiming for was really about producing transgenic crops. So I think it's important to put that in context. And then I went on for 5 years to work as a scientific director in a biotechnology company, looking at molecular diagnostics. So for food safety, for environment, and for bioterrorism. And so these are just really critical tools for ensuring, the biosafety of our food systems, of our environment, and, protecting everyone against bioterrorism. And I think it's important to understand that the study of biotechnology doesn't necessarily imply working on transgenic production of crops or any other entities. But really, it's really how do we look at the richness of the DNA on the planet and use that as tools to accelerate how we meet our challenges with genetic diversity. So I hope that's helpful to understand where I've been coming from.
Great. We'll keep taking questions from here because you're over there, Éliane, so able to interact with the people in Nairobi more easily beyond the session. Jian Chu.
Okay, Éliane, and my name is Jian Chu Xu from China program, and I think thanks for comment. I'd like to comment also my team, and my team in the past 8 years, we published 3,000 new species of fungi, both macro and micro, includes the nitrogen fixing fungi also. This week, we just published one paper in One Health, the new journal, and a very famous journal, and about 4 new species associated bats, and who happen to be pollinator and for durian in the tropic region, and also and my question also, what's your plan? Because we operate 37 countries. What's your plan to visit 20 country office at global wide?
I think that's an invitation, Éliane, to China.
I first want to just say, xie xie. It's really a pleasure to hear about the wonderful work you're doing in China. I think there's amazing, exciting work happening in China right now. I've had the opportunity while I was living in Canada to take part in conferences that were starting at 9 p.m. my time to 3 a.m. in China. So I've been very engaged with work happening in China, with collaborations of the FAO related to China. And I think there's amazing work happening at the interface of digitalization, artificial intelligence, and agriculture in China that can really be helpful around sustainable agriculture. I also want to congratulate you for all the publications that you've had and for this particular one on One Health, because I think it's an area of really important expertise for the planet and for humanity. And I think it was last week where officially the COVID-19 pandemic was declared over, but it's also a warning of the importance of how do we look at One Health to prevent the next epidemic and pandemic. So in terms of my plans to visit all country offices and visit all of you around the world, I think it's going to be really important that I'm mindful of my carbon footprint as I travel and to minimize it as much as possible. So I do look forward to engaging with all of you as much as possible virtually. And in time, I'm hoping to be here with you for many, many years. I do hope to be able to come and see all the country offices all through my tenure. And I look forward to engaging with each other creatively in ways that will allow us to grow the work you're doing. So I think what I learned through the COVID-19 pandemic was really that we can engage globally, digitally, while not having to travel. Yes, it's wonderful seeing all your beautiful places, and I look forward to being in Bogor later this month to attend the board meeting. And so any opportunity I will have, I look forward to being with all of you in person. I think it's important that you see me and that I see you and that we engage, because I am your leader and I'm here to be of service to all the work all of you are doing around the world. And last week, I had the opportunity to meet many of the leads in the work around our themes, as well as the country offices. I had the pleasure to meet many of you virtually already, and I look forward to more possibilities to do so. And please feel free to engage with me. I think you all have access to my email. I'm very present on social media, on LinkedIn, on Twitter, on Instagram. So please feel free to reach out and initiate any discussions you want with me. If you have any questions, I look forward to finding the time to engaging with you and to being here of support to the amazing work. And, you know, talking about the publications, I've been really amazed by the high quality science being produced by CIFOR-ICRAF. And what I look forward to is how do we take this amazing science and ensure that it has impact for the last mile to really bring sustainability and prosperity to smallholder farmers around the world, to elevate the work we do, the science we do in terms of how we continue to influence and grow our influence in policy. And also at this critical times where we have 7 years to 2030, how do we engage with the financial community so our science will accelerate how finance can really accelerate the work we need to do to grow nature-based solutions. And also around that, I think it's important to realize that in my previous position at Future Earth and Sustainability in the Digital Age, all the work I was doing was really around nature-based solutions. And really, my interest in this space goes really, really far. As a girl, young woman, my family had a farm in Rwanda, and I learned really sustainable practices through my mother, looking at how living in a remote area, we were able to really recycle, reuse. Everything was circular when I think about it in my childhood, because we didn't have access to garbage pickup. You know, everything we ate was composted. And so for me, today, where we are in terms of how to engage with circular economy, how to engage with circularity, how do we engage in ways that bring us towards a nature positive net zero world, are things that just were natural as a child. And how I'm so excited that the world, especially after COP15, that we have these targets that are going to help us accelerate in this direction. So I'm very excited to elevate the work of everyone here at CIFOR-ICRAF to help us get there.
Thank you, Éliane. And I believe that Andrew, yeah. So I think that was excellent that we had that opportunity for you to say a little bit more and inspire us even more. Am I correct, Fabio, that Andrew is now online?
Indeed. So I'll let Andrew put on his
Okay.
camera. Hi, Andrew.
Okay, so we've shown our ability for adaptive planning. Thank you, Nia. Thank you, Éliane. And let us now hand over to Andrew from the Doughnut Economics Action Lab to fire up this Science Week with some substance. Andrew, over to you.
Well, thank you so much. And my apologies for the mix-up. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I'm just coming in right now. It's 8:30 in the morning for me. I want to acknowledge that it's different times. I know that CIFOR is spread across the world and that everyone is joining in at different times. And I'd like to acknowledge as well the technologies that are allowing us to have this conversation and to come together. So without further ado, I will jump right in. I've prepared a few slides to share some ideas around how we're putting into practice the concepts of what we call donut economics and working with many change makers around the world. So let me see if this all works. And how about this one? You should be able to see my screen, correct?
Yes.
Excellent. Let me just jump right in. So I am the research and data analysis lead at Doughnut Economics Action Lab, which is an organization co-founded by my colleagues Kate Rayworth and Carlota Sanz, really to put the ideas that were written in a book called Doughnut Economics by Kate Rayworth into action, that basically people were starting to read this book and get fired up by the ideas and weren't waiting around for permission to put them into action. So we exist at Deal, really working with community leaders and business leaders and cities and regions and governments and so on, essentially helping to connect and make visible all of this energy that's already out there. And I'm delighted to share a little bit about it today. So where do I come from? I call myself an ecological economist. I discovered this field in 2010, so 13 years ago now. During my master's, I was 5 years into a Department of Economics, quite conventional economics training. Took a course almost by accident from a management school around environmental studies called Economics for Resource and Environmental Management. And I thought, well, they're not offering an environmental economics course in my program this year. So this sounds like what I'm looking for. Let me do it. It was a course in ecological economics. And I was the only mainstream economist in the class, everyone else in natural sciences or management. And my mind was blown, basically, because this course was essentially, it was centered on a critique, particularly around the scale of the economy. And this was something as a mainstream economist that I had never been exposed to. Questions like, how big should the economy be? How big is it? And how big, how big should it be, essentially? So these were questions that got me really thinking. I felt a little bit silly because it had never occurred to me before to ask those types of questions of the size of the economy in relation to our finite planet. And that set me off on a whole lot of reading and asking questions and reading more. And it led me to Doughnut economics and very deep down the rabbit hole of ecological economics. So that's where I'm coming from here today. And I just wanted to share some of what we call the 20th century economics, a subtle way of saying that we believe that this way of thinking about economics that I was taught is no longer, well, it's out of date. So the first picture that you see is essentially in economics, the picture of demand and supply, right? The X, where price and quantity are determined in an equilibrium. And what that does is it centers the market, right? And that idea that value is determined through price as shared in markets, it sidelines essentially anything that cannot be shared in markets. And so this notion of putting the markets front and center is something that in the 21st century, I think we need to step beyond. So that's the first image, the biggest image. So if you're looking at economics, here's the biggest image of the macro economy that you're likely to find. And you get, I won't go into all the details, but you have essentially, you see this circular flow of value going between households and businesses, and in the more extended versions, banks and government and trade. And this really forms the basis of our system of national accounts. And it's been quite useful in terms of seeing policy levers of if things are out of balance, then how do we rebalance them in this circular flow? But if you spend a bit of time with this image, you start to realize some core things that are missing. For example, the entirety of the natural living world is not there. And what we immediately see is that there's no source of energy or a sink for waste that's powering this circular flow, which of course, in the laws of thermodynamics is impossible. You also see that, we don't just show up as labor to work for businesses. We wake up in the morning in our households, we have families. There's a whole caring economy that's completely absent from this picture. And likewise, the commons, like where we are not in our households, but we're not working in the economy, there's all kinds of stewarding and co-creating and interactions that take place where money does not change hands, but which really form the basis of our social fabric. So a picture that doesn't include the natural living world, our households, or the commons, I believe is a need to really expand beyond that. So what's the picture of the selfie in 20th century economics? So Kate realized that rational economic man, Homo economicus, as he's known, didn't have actually a picture. So she drew him. She recognized that he was a man. He's always standing alone with no dependence or anyone. He has money in his hand, ego in his heart, and a calculator in his head and the living world at his feet. So he knows the price of everything. He's constantly calculating. He hates work. He loves to consume. And he's just a caricature of really what it means to be a human. But what we found is particularly some interesting research looking at economics students is that actually the vision of ourselves that we tell ourselves that we are influences who we actually become. And that there's actually research showing that economics students tend to be more like Homo economicus than other disciplines. So this who we tell ourselves that we are makes a difference. Finally, the goal. At the macroeconomic level, in economics, there actually is no goal. There's no overarching purpose of the macroeconomy as articulated in 20th century economics. But one has crept in and almost undermined, stolen the show, and that is the ever-ending, endless accumulation of GDP or national income or gross domestic product. And we now are at a point in the 21st century, because of the system that we have inherited, that we are dependent on this endless accumulation or this constant growth of GDP. Because if we don't receive that growth, then very bad things happen. We call it a recession. People's livelihoods are at risk. And there's this dependence upon something that actually, if you take it to its logical conclusion, cannot continue on a finite planet. So these images, I think, underpin so many of the challenges that we're facing in the 21st century, and we've inherited them from the 20th century economic system. And really, it's worth taking a step back to think and recognize that the 21st century has been marked by a series of recurring global crises. We had the financial meltdown in 2008 and the decade of austerity in many places that followed that. We're living in an age of climate and ecological breakdown with floods and droughts and wildfires and much more. We're also living in an age of protest crackdown where especially environmental and land defenders and youth who are seeing their futures in very uncertain terms, are rising up and protesting and being met with water cannons and increasing levels of repression by the world's governments and authorities. And of course, we're living through a third year now of COVID lockdown. We have just, as was mentioned, officially ended the pandemic. But of course, the impacts that we've all lived through in the past 3 years have been unprecedented. And I just want to note that the impacts of all of these crises have been felt disproportionately by age, by race, by gender, by wealth in the global north and in the global south. And that what they say to me essentially is that we are all interconnected, both with one another as well as with the rest of the living world, and that these crises are massively destabilizing, and for some are existential even, and that we have largely, once again, inherited these. They arise out of the very systems that we have inherited. And so I believe that there's a fundamental need to transform this vision, to transform this picture that we have inherited. And thankfully, there's a pluriverse of visions that can take us beyond the 20th century economic systems and things that we have inherited. So I will present one. Here it is. It's shaped like a donut. That's why we call it donut economics. We think of it as a compass for human prosperity, where really the aims to show the goal to meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. So if we think of resource use almost radiating out from the middle of this donut, we want to make sure that all people have enough so that they can meet their fundamental needs for water, for food, for health, for education, peace and justice, social equity, gender equality, and so on. Make sure that everyone has enough to go above that social foundation and into the green space of the donut. And these social priorities have actually been crowdsourced from the Sustainable Development Goals. So we can say with confidence that these are, I mean, the world's governments have agreed that these are the fundamental dimensions of what it means to be prosperous and to thrive, because that's what forms the basis of the social priorities of the SDGs. So make sure that everyone gets into that green space of the donut. But, and it's a big but, make sure that we don't overshoot the ecological ceiling, because then we start placing too much pressure on our planetary home. We start causing climate change and acidifying the oceans and, you know, causing dead zones in ocean habitats, or destroying ecosystems and the critical biodiversity that they house. And so these 9 planetary boundaries are what Earth system scientists say maintain the stability of our planetary home. So we need to stay within those and keep ourselves within that green space of the donut. And to me, what this image shows is that all of a sudden, now we're not talking about the goal of endless accumulation. Now the goal is about balance, and it's about staying in that space in a dynamic kind of equilibrium. And so Kate drew this image in 2012. This is the most latest version, updated in her book in 2017. And she recognized that this image of balance was actually, if you look to many, many other cultures, it's really, the issue is more our Western mindset and the economic system that we have inherited. Because if you look to many, many other cultures, you see again and again this recurring theme of balance, of dynamic equilibrium, and of finding that safe and just space for humanity or for society. So really, we think of the donut as almost a Western developed concept that hopefully can serve as some kind of a bridge for our Western mindsets to relearn what has already been known for millennia by many, many other cultures and so on. So that's one picture of the donut. If that is our picture, then we know that today we are currently far, far out of balance. So this is all of these little red wedges on the inside of the donut. You can think of those, it's a global picture, the proportion of the global population who is falling short of their needs. So if you go around, you can see that there's billions of people who are not meeting their most essential basic needs. And they live in cities and nations, both rich and poor. While at the same time, we're overshooting multiple planetary boundaries. So the climate change boundary at the top, the ecological ceiling is 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. And you can see that today we're overshooting that. We're around 416 parts per million, I believe. So, and actually the science around these planetary boundaries continues to advance. So this is the most updated science available, which paints an even more challenging picture. So to me, this is a very challenging picture in my view, but at the same time, it just really demonstrates that we need to transform our economic system from both sides at the same time. And that is not the economic system that we inherited. So it's almost liberating in a sense, because we know that we need new economic policies, new models, new theories, new ways of interacting that haven't been invented before. Because I'm so sure that when others, our children's children look at us and they pull from the archives this picture and other headlines, they're going to say to us, this picture was out there. You knew that this was happening. What did you do once that you knew? And that to me is a massive motivating force for why I do the work that I do. And I know that CIFOR is also very, very engaged with similar problems. So let's dive in. This is a global picture, but we know, of course, that the responsibility for overshooting planetary boundaries is held by some, and the capacity and the ability to meet the social foundation is overwhelmingly, it's held by others. But of course, those are interconnected through histories and legacies of colonialism and post-colonial, the world economic system that we live in. So how can we start teasing apart, given the focus of this conference around equity and action, of taking account of those responsibilities and gesturing towards the accountability of them? Well, one approach is to look at a single indicator and looking back over time. And this is some work that I've been doing with Jason Hickel around the climate change boundary. So on the left-hand side, you can see here, this is a chart showing cumulative carbon emissions with respect to climate targets. And the axis is labeled in such a way that the 1.5 degree remaining carbon budget, as determined by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's most recent assessment, that equals 1. And on the x-axis, we can see from 1850 to 2019 historical emissions, and then from 2020 to 2050, a couple scenarios, one of which shows business as usual if we continue along the historical trends that we've been following over the past, almost 200 years. And then another scenario is the net zero, which shows that we looked at about 170 countries here, and this is the aggregate of all of them. And it shows that if all nations follow a net zero pathway, decarbonizing to 2050, then we will it is still possible to stay within the 1.5 degree remaining carbon budget. But of course, that is what is needed to avoid the worst impacts of climate change as per the most recent science. But of course, we know that if that were to be the case, then some people have emitted too much and some people have not emitted much at all. For example, if we look at the global north, which is a series of 39 countries, essentially Western Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, a handful of other rich industrialized countries, we can see that they cross their fair shares based on a population equality-based metric of a fair share. They crossed that before the 1950s, and the 1.5 degree fair share crossing in 1970, around 1980 for their 2 degree fair share, and currently more than 2.5 times over their fair share of the 1.5 degree budget. So even if these nations, followed the net zero scenario that many of which have pledged under the Paris Agreement nationally determined contributions, even if they follow those highly ambitious pathways, they would still be more than 2.5 times above their fair share. But at the same time, the rest of the world, where 80% of humanity lives in the global south, is actually right at their 350 parts per million fair share. And even if they continued along their accelerating pathways to 2050, they would just be at around their 1.5 degree remaining budget. But of course, we live in a world where that is no longer possible because the global north has already appropriated the atmospheric commons in such a degree that these nations now need to mitigate far more rapidly than would otherwise be required. And so the story with this is essentially the global south would be losing about half of their fair shares. And I believe that forms a very strong justification for a conversation around compensation and around reparations, and just acknowledging that this historical responsibility for the climate breakdown that we are envisioning. So we can talk about that a little bit more in the discussion if there's interest. So that's one approach that we can use, is to dive into one indicator and start looking back over time. Another approach that I've been involved with is leading a study looking at around 150 nations and just downscaling with the best available data from the global donut to the national scale. And here are 4 countries that we can show, just illustrating the range. And I know many of you are tuning in from either Kenya or Indonesia or other places online. So if we look at Kenya, I mean, you can see a lot of red in the center of that donut. So there's large human deprivation that we know. But at the same time, Kenya is not overshooting any of the ecological boundaries that we analyzed in this study. So they're within their fair shares of planetary boundaries. Then we have Indonesia, again, doing a little bit better in terms of social performance based on these internationally comparable metrics, but at the same time overshooting or having a larger footprint on the environment. In China, even more, double whammy of overshooting multiple planetary boundaries while falling short. And in Canada, which is the country where I was born, we can just see, doing relatively well in terms of social performance. Once again, these are internationally comparable metrics. We know there's deprivation in Canada as well and inequality, but it's masked by these global or national aggregates. But what really strikes is just the massive levels of overshoot by those living in Canada. And I think that these images, it just goes to show the challenge of, well, almost it challenges the idea that nations like Canada or the Scandinavian countries like Norway and Sweden, we often hear should be seen as role models. But actually, if you look at many of the high-income nations, they have a picture very similar to what it looks like for Canada. What we do find, because this is, once again, quite challenging, there is a country that's the closest of all, and that's Costa Rica, which is essentially still not in the donut completely, overshooting a little bit, but essentially being the closest in terms of achieving social outcomes. They're the most efficient in terms of achieving social outcomes at a given level of resource use. So there is cause for hope. And I think that it just goes to show that Costa Rica has largely somewhat been aiming towards this with their reforestation campaigns and so on. But even they could do much more. And so I think that this, again, it shows a picture that if we were to direct policies towards actually this goal of meeting the needs of all within the means of the living planet, then I do feel confident that we could get there. So here are as many countries, as many donuts as I could fit on a chart. And you can see that down in the bottom left here is Kenya and Indonesia. You get China, Canada way over here on the top right. And what this is meant to show is that where we want to be is in the top left, where we're meeting the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. And what we see is that no nation, although Costa Rica is closest, no nation can put up its hand and say that it's there. And I think that it's also at the same time worth noting and acknowledging that these donuts are almost placed separately on a chart, but we also know that they are deeply interconnected through legacies of colonialism, through military power, corporate power, through trade and finance rules of the world economic system, through resource extraction, and on the impacts of climate change, which are felt first and hardest usually by the poorest and most marginalized societies. And often these directionalities go from the richest who are enjoying the benefits of the global economic system to often the poorest in the global south. So I think that's important to acknowledge. And also that if we look at the history of economic development, almost we see that it follows this arrow, right? That it's almost swooshing past the donut where we want to be and moving into overshoot. And these 20th century dynamics are driven by economic growth, and we would characterize them as a degenerative and divisive pathways to wealth, because many are left behind and we're simultaneously, it's highly unsustainable on our planetary home. So what we need to do is every nation must transform, but of course in different pathways in order to get there. So for the lowest income countries of the world, how can they rise up and follow a pathway that's never been done before of meeting the needs of all their people without going into very, very large ecological overshoot? That's a pathway that hasn't been done. And the middle income and emerging countries, how can they reorient, almost do a 90-degree turn from the current trajectories, and they too follow a pathway that's never been done before into the donut? And finally, the highest income countries of the world, like Canada, like many places in the EU and beyond, these countries need to also follow an unprecedented trajectory of massively reducing their levels of pressure on the planet, while at the same time, without adversely impacting their relatively high levels of human well-being. So each of these pathways are fundamental transformations, and it's going to be a challenge, but I think that we need to just recognize that this is the 21st century dynamics that we need in order for equity, for action, and for the people and planet to thrive. And we call these regenerative and distributive pathways, and they're critically by design. So let me talk a little bit about what that means. So essentially, we're arguing that in order to change the future, we need to change these dynamics from a degenerative economic system that's linear, that's taking resources, that makes them into stuff, that uses them for a little bit, often only once, and then throws them away or loses them. And this is running down Earth's critical life-supporting systems. And what we need is to transform to a far more regenerative economic system that uses resources in a much more creatively and collectively. When it comes to biological materials, we allow nature to follow her own regenerative pathways and work with her within the cycles of the living world. And when it comes to technical materials like plastics and metals and other materials that are human created, we should take inspiration from nature and aim to restore and refurbish and use those material sources as much as possible. So some examples, if we think at the level of landscapes, right? So we obviously need to move beyond the degenerative practices of, clear-cutting forests and land degradation, but we need to move also beyond the notion of just zero deforestation and thinking that that's sustainable, because given the amount of damage that has already occurred in most ecosystems around the world, we need to move beyond just do no harm to actively restoring and regenerating. And that is, I believe, what's needed for a regenerative future. Similarly, for manufacturing, clearly we need to move beyond the practice of built-in obsolescence, where phones and electronics and things are designed to break down after a few years, just so that in order to prop up the profit margins of companies and so on. But we can likewise do far more than just being recyclable, right? We can actually be creative and design our products so that they're repairable, so that they're modular, so that we can retrofit and refurbish, and just be generally much more collectively careful and creative with our use of resources. So that's one of the dynamics, degenerative to regenerative. But also, we've inherited a deeply divisive economic system where opportunity and value are being captured in the hands of a very, very few. So, I think the number of billionaires has doubled within the past 15 years or so, from 1,000 billionaires to more than 2,000 billionaires. And that system, that level of inequality, it's just not compatible, I don't believe, with getting into the donuts. And what we need to do is transform to a far more distributive system where we're sharing opportunity and value with all who co-create it. And at the end of the day, given that we are in an interconnected society, that ends up being essentially everyone. So again, we can think of some examples. Here's just a somewhat tongue-in-cheek example of a divisive system, of just being in traffic jam. So divisive one, we're all in our own private vehicles stuck in traffic, but we don't want to have an inclusive system where now we have public transit and we have buses that they too are stuck in a traffic jam. So that is not the level of ambition that we should go for. What we actually need is to redesign and be far more distributive so that there are dedicated mass transit pathways where the buses are completely separated, and so that they're affordable and faster and attractive. And it makes it so that it's irresistible to follow these. Why would you even want to take a private vehicle if you get there faster in a bus? So this is the aspiration. Similarly, for wages, obviously we move beyond poverty wages, but a living wage, to me, it just sounds like such a low bar, right? Of course we should pay. If workers are dedicating their time and resources to producing and working for us, we should pay them enough to live on. But we can also move to a far more distributive model where not only is it a living wage, but also we can think of different ways of sharing the benefits of, for example, profit shares and many other, designs for cooperative business operations that could be done there. And here's an example from John Lewis. So far I have spoken about essentially the big picture, the global donut, how we could dive into taking into account of responsibility, looking at differences across countries, and as well as the dynamics of how we could change from to be regenerative and distributive. But so far it's been very high level. So how can we then land these concepts into the places where we live? Like, for example, some of the work we've been doing with cities. And our argument is that we can think of the global donut, we can think of it as unrolling it in order to open up space between the social foundation and the ecological ceiling, to start mapping what that could look like in each place. And it's work that we've done in Amsterdam, kickstarted there, and is now spread to over 70 cities. And it's underpinned by this framework, which asks a critical question: how can our city or our region become a home to thriving people in a thriving place, while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? And critically, that's a complicated question, but it can be broken apart into these 4 lenses, as we call them, separating local aspirations on one hand, thriving people in a thriving place, and global responsibilities within, while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet, both locally and globally. And let me just jump into these questions very briefly. So how can all the people of our city thrive? That really depends on, everyone has these basic needs for food, water, health, education, so on. But the ways in which we satisfy those needs, it varies enormously by culture, across places, as well as across time. Those are definitions of what is acceptable. It also changes. So the answer to how we thrive here depends critically upon a public conversation of what that should be. So how can our city be as generous as the wildland next door? This is a question informed by the biomimicry thinker Janine Benyus. And she worked with Kate in developing this methodology. And she would say, if she was going to Nairobi or to any other place, could say, okay, take me to the wildland next door and show me how nature has learned to cleanse the air and to store carbon and to store groundwater after a storm and to house biodiversity and so on. And how can we recognize that this healthy ecosystem next door can be used as an aspiration, as an ambition, so that the city, the human settlement, can likewise aim to cleanse the air and store carbon and store groundwater and house biodiversity. So it's a radically ambitious change in how we design our cities and our settlements, but at the same time, it's also in a way the most natural thing that we could aim to do. So these are the local aspirations, and in many places, this is where almost the Scandinavian countries and those our conventional role models tend to show up quite well and do relatively well. But of course, that's only half the story, because we also need to recognize our global responsibility. So how can our city respect the health of the whole planet? And this is where the planetary boundaries come in, because we can think of the food and the clothing and the electronics and all the goods and services flowing through a place and the wastes that go out, and ask yourselves, are the carbon emissions and the material use and the various impacts on our planetary home that are associated with that level of consumption, could those be extended to all people? Or what level of unsustainability are we at? And likewise, instead of thinking of the resource use associated with our goods and services, we can also think of how can our city respect the well-being of all people? So again, think of the food and the clothing and the electronics, but instead of the resources, think of who grew the food and who stitched the clothing and who assembled the electronics and distributed them and brought them to our doors. And likewise, of course, we're connected with the rest of the world socially through more than just global supply chains, of course. We also have, how are the impacts of past decisions through climate change and through how are those impacting livelihoods in other parts of the world? And how do our policies and the economic system, how does that encourage a more solidarity-focused interconnections? Or how is it maybe holding those back? How do we deal with migrants? And likewise, there's sports, there's tourism, there's a spaghetti plot of interconnections that we can start to unpack. So these are the 4 lenses of the donut unrolled portrait, as we call it. And they are complicated questions when you think about it. But what we've found working with cities and with regions and with policymakers is that even though it's complex, what you start to see is that it provides a more holistic picture. Then you can start to see interconnections across areas that were maybe not visible when you were looking in a more siloed approach. So critically, when it comes
are you getting close to the end, Andrew?
Yeah. I just have a couple more slides here.
Super.
Okay. Awesome. Okay, so these are the core questions, which is, when it comes to the Doughnut, I guess from a data-led perspective, we really always want to be asking, what's our target or our commitment? And is it ambitious enough? And comparing that to how we are doing. So that's the core, and it's somewhat different from other measures of approaching metrics where you're only looking at performance over time or with respect to others. So you always want to have a target, but also start layering on what positive initiatives are underway and what now must we do in order to make it happen. So using data as an input. So I will go very quickly through here is that this methodology was developed as in April 2020. We followed it up with a methodological guide. And as of April 2022, we now have 5 tools in more than 70 cities and 30 community groups who are working with these. And what we see that as very much a power of peer-to-peer inspiration, where one city can inspire another city, or a community can inspire another community, much more than a person who's standing on the stage. And we think that that power of peer-to-peer inspiration is something that might be strong enough to actually unlock and turn around the trajectories that we're on. So I was going to briefly raise some examples of some places in Barcelona, many in the global north, but also increasingly in Ipoh. They're using it as a city compass in Malaysia, in Thimphu in Bhutan, a very, very interesting integration with their gross national happiness framework and exploring how donut economics could be used as a tool there. Mexico City using it as a scenarios, visualizing future pathways and using that as a communication tool. And of course, so far I've spoken about cities and places, but we're also working with businesses and communities and education. So I just want to wrap up by saying that these 20th century economics, we've left it far behind. What we now need for 21st century is to be looking clearly at the goal, meet the needs of all within the means of the living planet, to be regenerative and distributive, while recognizing that we also need locally relevant indicators and metrics and frameworks that speak to each given place and can take us collectively towards the goal. So I'll wrap it up there. You're all invited to check out the Doughnut Economics Action Lab community platform. You can join, become members, post tools and stories, and so on. But most of all, I really want to hopefully inspire you all for this week, this agenda that you have up ahead, to the extent that Doughnut economics can be useful in these concepts, then yeah, very much looking forward to engaging further. So I'll leave it there and looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Andrew. What we're going to do now is get some perspectives from 3 panelists. We'll take all 3 and then give you a chance to respond. So please take some notes as we go. And may I ask Peter Manang from Nairobi to go first.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Andrew, for a very fascinating and interesting presentation. I really like it. And I'm a big fan of of Doughnut economics as well. As you were speaking, and I'm thinking about how do we apply this to our work, and how do we bring this into the thinking in terms of agroforestry, in terms of forestry and land management that we do on a daily basis. A couple of things come to mind, actually, in terms of the thinking around framing things around the Doughnut model. And I think one of the things that really, comes to mind is how we use that to look at how do we apply trade-offs and synergies across the different components of this. And it strikes me that when we think about a landscape and we are looking at how do we strive to achieve these multiple objectives and these functions within a landscape, in a way, we are actually having different trade-offs between the rise and the reorient and the reduce. It's actually a combination of these three things that actually happen in a given landscape for us to be able to get to that top left-hand corner that you were referring to. And that's very interesting for us in the sense that data sort of helps us and evidence to get to that point. And I wonder what your thoughts would be about that in terms of how data helps us to move more towards that left corner. The second thing that I sort of thought about as you were talking is the appropriateness of scale. I really liked your examples on cities, and we grapple a lot with different sort of scales in the way we apply this. And one of the things that we notice, for example, when we start looking at deforestation at landscape scale or at jurisdictional scale, then it quickly comes to us that even at that scale, you can't have answers. What actually happens in terms of getting to that top left corner is actually dependent on what happens at a scale beyond where you are. And that's an interesting question for us in terms of what is the degree to which multiple visualizations of different scales would present to you a scenario that will allow you to address things. And if you look at nationwide wise as well, when we look at deforestation in the Amazon, for example, in Brazil, you can't do anything about that. When we started working on deforestation in Brazil, then very quickly it was exported to Ecuador, to Peru, to Bolivia. And the same thing happens with all of these questions of deforestation, emissions embedded in trade. That really complicates the scale at which you look at your Doughnut model and how that interaction happens. And that's an interesting thing, because you've been thinking about this for so long. For me, it would be interesting how you look at scale and how that plays in. The third thing that I kind of got interested in is justice. On your slide number 8, where you talked about historical responsibility, that was quite interesting because we talk about this a lot in the climate change debate, which is what you used. And we talk about common but differentiated responsibility. A lot of that is based in history. And that's looking back and saying, we've got to have some compensation, we've got to have some, reparations in those languages, and what they call loss and damage debate. But the other thing that has been intriguing to me is how you apply that forward. Because when we started looking at deforestation in the Congo Basin, and there was this discussion about baselines, some of us in the room were asking the question, how do we make sure that a baseline in the Congo Basin is not a 0 point? Because if it's a 0 point, what it means is that the people, all of those variables in the middle, the first circle of the donut, you can't even create roads to provide the basic services for these people. You can't provide infrastructure because you can't have zero deforestation to do those infrastructure. So the question was, what is an allowable allowance to compensate for that inequity in the future, in a future baseline that will allow justice for those people that haven't even had the basic services in that first circle? And that's a complex and interesting question, because there was a whole debate in the room within the UNFCCC, that should not be allowed. But then that's a justice question. It's not only a question of compensation before of the historical inequities, it is a question of how do you move forward in a just, fair way. So how do you apply that forward from a historical, instead of a historical perspective, have a justice perspective going forward? And that's really interesting to me. My last point is about technology, knowledge, and capacity. I think that for us in the agroforestry, forestry, land management, nature-based solution space, it is incredibly important for the places where we work to have the capacity, the knowledge, and the technologies to help us rise or reorient or reduce. Those technologies, that knowledge, that capacity is very much in short supply in the places where we work. So for us to be able to move in that direction, there has to be significant shift in the thinking, in curricula, in the way we work, in our knowledge and outreach processes to be able to enable that rising to that top left corner or that reorientation or that sort of reduction in different pathways that we've already taken. And I'll stop there just to get Andrew's reaction. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And we're now coming back to Bogor and Mulia Nur Hassan.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I had the privilege of looking at the slideshow last night, so I've written down some of my comments, but a lot of it really resembles what Peter Minang just said. But first of all, I'd like to say that I'm a fan of the Doughnut economic work and the Doughnut economic book and the Doughnut economic book, and I think that the book Doughnut Economic and the Poor Economic really changed my perspective about what economic and economists could do and what economists shouldn't do. And knowing about Doughnut economic concept is one thing, but reading and listening the book and read by Kate Raworth herself gives a strong sense of how the whole concept came from. And a lot of people see economic, honestly, I also saw economic promotes of everlasting growth for the rich for centuries. And in the book, Kate suggested a lot of evidence from the economists over the centuries who suggested otherwise. And it's really fascinating to hear that there's a different perspective from what economy could do. And it's like a breath of fresh air for me. And I love that it now became a movement more than a research, so it goes beyond technicality and there's an ambition to push it to change at the political level. And you succeeded that you could push, I think, Amsterdam and then Costa Rica to move to Doughnut economic direction, so congratulations for that. And I wish that one day you could also inspire my country to move towards that direction. And on that note, I would like to raise a question which also took up on Peter Minang's comment about the scalability of Doughnut economic. And coming from Indonesia, we're an archipelagic country. We see that the Doughnut, I think as a food scientist, I would say we are expecting a Doughnut that has more like minty green latte in the middle without too much of strawberry topping all over. So it's like, I see that the Indonesian Doughnut was looking like a bit more favorable, like not too much of strawberry topping all over and with a lot of green latte in the middle. But, you know, we are a country that consists of 16,000 islands or even more. And we have like 270 million people living in one country, but more than half of these 270 million people actually live in Java Island where we are now. And so with this heavy ecological pressure to one island over decades, that for sure, we already realized, people who live in Java, that this island is about to sink. This island is no longer livable anymore for the centuries to come. And so our government has planned to move our capital, Jakarta, to another island that is more pristine, like Borneo. And so I wonder how would Doughnut economic took upon this dynamic? Like if you are scaling it at the country level, how do you see this? Like people living in this island, they're not so, they're not educated enough, they're not food secure enough, but then people living in different island, they're completely like in another level, perhaps emitting gas equally to people in Europe. And I think that just one donut for one country doesn't really express this. So going back to what Peter Minang was asking, how do you, kind of suggest the scalability of the donut economic? And also, again, looking up after Peter Minang, don't you think that at the end of the day, we kind of need landscape approach, considering there's a lot of country with different landscape, very various landscape. And then what do you think also about the donut boundaries being expanded through technological advancement? Because, I think that's what also the Western are promoting, that we can actually took upon this challenge of climate change and ecological pressure through technology. So I would like to know what you think about that, pushing through the boundary through technology. And also, I think lastly, one of my concern is that the donut economic will be trapped in polarity, like the nature-based solution versus technological solution, right-based approach versus a market-based approach. And I think there's a risk in being trapped in polarity, because it could be difficult to move anywhere, because you could gain stronger support. Is it my time yet? Okay. You could gain stronger support from one polar, but then you couldn't really get anyone from the other polar. And to that bump from Fergus, I want to close with one of my favorite quote in the book, which is also related to polarity. Kate Raworth cited someone saying that it is difficult to make someone understand about something when their salary is depending on not understanding it. And so how does your concept go about it? Thank you.
Excellent. And finally, Paolo Cerruti from Nairobi.
Thank you. Very nice. Mulia, thanks a lot, Mulia. I wanted to start with this quote from Upton Sinclair, which is quoted actually in Kate's book. So I will not quote it again, but I'll link that to some other articles of Jason Heikel. Thanks a lot for quoting, by the way, the work that you will be publishing with him. And I'll speak to your slide about the divisive part of the values that we have today, with the values and the opportunities in the hand of a few people. We work in countries where it is very difficult to see the same picture that you see in the Western world, especially when you are down in the field and you try to understand what reform could look like. And as you or Kate and also Jason recognize very well, is that such reforms are very unlikely to be handed down from above. Because of course, they run against very powerful vested interest. And so where we work, normally this structural transformation that is needed can only be achieved through political struggle. And this political struggle, unfortunately, especially from the countries where I work, has a tendency to come up with Kalashnikov. So, and we would like to avoid that. Now, the question for you, because I see that you have moved from research to try to get your ideas into cities and places around the world. What would be, also taking the opportunity that we have a new CEO, you are speaking to somebody very fresh with a completely different set of eyes for an institution like CIFOR-ICRAF. So what do you think could be the role of a research for action or research for development organization like CIFOR-ICRAF in this type of world where we do research in countries where political struggle is certainly something that is conducive to change, but we would like to have this political struggle not go into the wrong direction. So be something that is creative and that speaks to your new model, new theories, new ideas that can come out. Again, it's a lot of tension, but if you have some suggestions, we are very, very well taken. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Paolo. So, oh yeah. So, Andrew, that's put you on the spot. Would you like to respond to those comments?
Yes, thank you very much for these wonderful, wonderful comments. So I will not be able to provide answers, but I will provide some thoughts as we go through, and thank you for your reflections on that. So I'll just start from the beginning as I took some notes. So from Peter, the 4 points were around how does, what are the trade-offs and synergies, and how does data help us move in navigating those synergies, particularly from a landscape perspective. So I think that how would I put it? I guess I'll start with the question about how does data help us move. So I strongly believe that data, there's the notion of an objective type of presentation of data is not something that I embrace. So I tend to feel that data is always contested. There's always questions on who owns it and who collected it and who is presenting it. And that, so I see data fundamentally often as political with a small p. And that is, I think that there's power there. And a lot of my work has been to try to create metrics that I believe illustrate data in a manner that fits with this broad paradigm that we need to meet the needs of all within the means of the living planet. So when I present data, it's always in that respect. And I think that you can be, a very conventional scientist or could critique that you're being, normative, that these are normative claims, it's subjective and so on. But I think that the idea of objectivity in data and empirical work is kind of an illusion. So what the most important aspect is to be very clear around the assumptions that are being made and the methods that are being employed when you're presenting data. And that's the approach that I take in my work, is just saying, listen, we do take a stand and we say that there are certain minimum thresholds that must be respected in terms of avoiding critical human deprivation and certain levels of avoiding planetary degradation. But we are also clear on what those particular boundaries are so that others can critique them and we can talk about it. So I think that is one way of how data can help us move that I mentioned in the talk was really doing that effort of identifying targets and objectives. It's not a common thing in many metrics. And so I think that putting that out on the table is a source, it's an input for discussion, and that has value. When it comes to identifying trade-offs and synergies, I think that is something that would be very, very context specific. So, and this reaches to the point, I'm jumping around a little bit, but the point that Mulia had, where recognizing, and also Peter, that the idea that one donut for a single country is not enough. I completely agree with that. Our 150 country global snapshot analysis, so to speak, we are the first to recognize, I'm the first to recognize that is a first rough approximation, that actually no country sees itself reflected in it's missing all kinds of pieces because of the nature of almost flattening the available empirical data in order to be comparable rigorously across countries. If you actually look into a single country, of course, it's much more rich and it's much more holistic. And that's what that 4-lens methodology that I presented aims to start teasing out. So instead of being comparable across places, that donut unrolled canvas, it aims to be locally relevant for each place so that you can start teasing out like, for example, that local ecological, how can we aim to be as generous as the wildland next door? I think that really speaks to the expertise in CIFOR-ICRAF around landscapes, around, just understanding how nature has learned to thrive in this place and how we can take aspiration from that and let her be and regenerate her, while at the same time, recognizing that we have global responsibilities too. So for me, that four lens framework was actually really, really liberating, because I found I get in a lot of conversations, especially with the more conventional donut, that you're almost pitting local and global against one another. Whereas actually, if you separate them out analytically, recognizing they still have fuzzy boundaries, but if you do so, then it actually opens up space to say, actually, our ecosystems do both things. They have a planetary scale as well as a local scale, and our ambitions in both realms can be different. One is to stay within planetary boundaries, and the other is to aim to match or exceed our local ecological levels of thriving. So those are some thoughts that come to mind around scale and around data. The equity and future baselines comment, Peter, is really, really, really interesting and really important. And that zero, an aspiration for zero doesn't allow one to reach, a minimum basic essential. So that to me is something that the donut helps illustrate very clearly, that it's not just about minimizing environmental impact. It's also that people need a minimum level, a sufficient level, not a minimum to be living in poverty, but a sufficient level to live dignified lives. And my thinking around it, specifically for the climate change one, is from a forward-looking perspective. We're now at a point, if we want to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, that there is a need to mitigate, to reduce emissions in all places, essentially, to meet that 1.5 degree boundary. But I think that the work that I showed in that slide number 8, by illustrating the degree to which some places have overshot their fair shares and some are just so far below, is a conversation for compensation, I would argue in financial terms, so that while mitigating, while achieving that net zero pathway, that those who have fallen, who have had their fair shares appropriated would be compensated, and they could use those funds in order to achieve, livelihood goals, development goals, and so on. While at the same time, I fully recognize that will be a huge challenge, and it's a very, very ambitious pathway. So that's how my thinking is going around it, at least. And certainly we need technology and knowledge to shift from the rise, reorient, and so on. I think we also, another side of that coin, or another factor that could implement, is the levels of inequality that we have. So moving from divisive to distributive, and as well to, there's many, many factors you could imagine would influence our ability to live within the donut. Some are more empirical. You could even imagine some being just much more a mindset shift in what we view as progress. And you can imagine emotional relations with one another as well, which are not so conducive to metrics. But I think that mindset shift is almost the most important thing. You also mentioned pushing boundaries with technology, Mulia, which is a great question. I think the important thing to note from the donut's perspective is that we present it as a conceptual framework that has two main goals, really. One is to avoid critical human deprivation, and the other is to avoid critical planetary degradation. Now, our definitions of what critical human deprivation and critical planetary degradation, what they actually are defined to be, are subject to change, right? The social priorities of the SDGs the world's governments have agreed on this kind of minimal baseline. The planetary boundaries on another level, but the planetary boundaries is advancing. The Sustainable Development Goal 2030 is approaching. Those are going to be renegotiated. So those definitions of what boundaries are subject to some change over time, and as a result of technology and other factors. So I think that certainly technology could play a role in that respect. The risk of polarity, Kate has a wonderful comment where she says the donut it's not left wing, it's not right wing, it's aiming to define these core essential minimum criteria, sufficient criteria. It's not left wing or right wing. And donuts don't have wings. So the risk of polarity, we aim to essentially to lay out a fundamental basis upon which all people could agree. But of course, the dough of the donut is not an area that, like, we make no policy prescriptions, so to speak, that we're very, very aware of the importance of local context and local relevance, especially when we're talking about entry points for achieving transformative action. We've really seen this in the cities work, that cities and regions and local governments and so on are approaching donut economics tools and comments from my colleague Leonora Gercheva has identified, just released a publication recently, identifying 9 different pathways that cities and regions are engaging with the concepts, from using it as a data-led approach to informing their policies to an overarching holistic framework, and so on and so on. So we don't aim to prescribe, I guess. What really donut economics is aiming to do is to provide tools which are big enough to encompass, that can provide a frame or a canvas that people can layer on their challenges and identify entry points for action for themselves, so to speak. It's not up to us to do so. And that gets to the question about Paolo, where, of course, we want to avoid violence, we want to avoid Kalashnikovs, and I completely agree that reforms are unlikely to take place from above. At Deal, we try to work at 3 different levels. A lot of our energy goes towards working with community, just connecting community change makers. So on our platform, you'll see more than 10,000 people have created profiles that make them visible on our platform so that you can see one another and start making those connections. We think that the community level is just, as I said, one of the core ways that we can hopefully harness the power of peer-to-peer inspiration, because when people submit tools and stories of engaging with donut economics on our platform, we hope they're all available in the comments. We hope that others pick them up, they adapt them, they share back those changes. And as I was mentioned before, hopefully that's strong enough for it all. What could be the role of research for action and being creative? So that's a huge question that I don't have a response to, really. As the research and academia lead at Donut Economics Action Lab, I'm trying to hold that. I'm grappling with a very similar question, Paolo, that it's like, how can we make sure that action comes before research, or that our research goes towards action without getting sucked into research just for its own sake? And I know that CIFOR-ICRAF has been grappling with that for decades and decades and being quite successful. So I'm looking forward more to learning from you in that respect. But I guess from our approach at Deal, how I'm seeing one role at least is in terms of convening. What we're seeing is a lot of researchers and analysts and people who are interested in the concepts and interested in using their research towards deepening those concepts. And we don't aim to be a giant research group or anything. So what I see for myself is just a capacity to host spaces that researchers and people can connect with one another and hopefully learn from one another. And while at the same time, as I mentioned, in my own research, I try to make very clear developing metrics that make that 21st century goals visible is another key part. So those are some thoughts. Not sure if it's helpful, but I'll leave it there for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew. And those are very helpful comments. And I'm already beginning to think that research for action is probably a better label than research for development for us. I think what this interaction has really highlighted is, on the one hand, a need to be challenging received wisdom in order to make transformative change, to do things differently. But at the same time, that can create a polarity that is quite negative in relation to making progress. And being able to navigate that space between being challenging, but to do so in a way that is positive, is perhaps addressed a little bit, as you've been suggesting, by operating across nested scales from the global to the local. And that's very much in keeping with the way that the convening role that you mentioned is something that's part of the new strategy that CIFOR-ICRAF has around transformative partnership platforms, engagement landscapes, and flagship products. So maybe we're going in the right direction, but we need to take a very big leap forward in order to make faster progress to meet these really pressing challenges. So thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you, everybody. And we'll close this session at that point and reconvene at 45 minutes past the hour.
Which is right now, Fergus. So please make it fast and come back. Yeah, because the session is technically starting immediately now. So.